On November 28, 1867, at Cypress Bend Plantation near Baton Rouge, Louisiana, something happened that would shake the very foundations of the Old South. It was Thanksgiving Day, and Colonel William Rutledge and his 3 sons were preparing for their feast, laughing loudly and toasting with whiskey while waiting for their golden turkey. But in the kitchen, house cook Esther Carter had different plans. The pork lard bubbling in her cast-iron pot wasn't meant for frying their dinner, it was meant for them. Before the day was over, all 3 Rutledge sons would be dead, scalded by the very oil that was supposed to cook their meal. This is the story of a woman who had endured decades of cruelty, watched her daughter sold into slavery, and finally decided that justice would be served hot. Before we dive deeper into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to hit that like button. The night before vengeance. The kitchen at Cypress Bend never slept, especially not the night before Thanksgiving. Logs crackled in the fireplace like breaking bones. Iron pots hissed under the weight of boiling fat. The air was thick with the smell of spices, vinegar, and something else. Something that had been waiting for years. Esther moved through the smoky kitchen like she belonged to it completely. Her bare feet knew every creaking floorboard. Her hands, wrapped in damp cloth, worked steadily, stirring, chopping, seasoning. But her mind wasn't on the food, it was on the door and what would come through it. That door had haunted her for years. The way it would burst open without warning, bringing laughter from men who never bothered to knock. Tonight, the Rutledge sons were coming home for the feast, and Esther was ready for them. 2 years had passed since the Civil War ended. The newspapers talked about reconstruction and progress, but at Cypress Bend, nothing had really changed. The Rutledge still ruled their land like kings. They just called it labor instead of slavery now, paying pennies for brutal work and calling it freedom. Colonel William Rutledge sat in his big house, sipping bourbon with a Union pin on his jacket. The same jacket stained with the blood of countless whippings. His sons had grown into the monsters he had raised them to be. Nathaniel, the oldest, once dragged a young woman through the sugarcane fields by her hair. Thomas, the middle son, would spit in any food he thought smelled too African. And Silas, the youngest, had a cruel laugh that could chill your soul. He was the one who had told Esther, with that twisted smile, that her 7-year-old daughter Clara had been sold north for a better life. Esther never saw her child again. Now, 30 years later, those 3 men were coming home. The kitchen had grown older and quieter, but the ghosts of the past had not. When evil walked through the door, outside, a wagon rolled over gravel. Dogs barked in the distance. Heavy boots climbed the wooden steps. The door opened and 3 men walked in, dressed in fine wool and dripping with arrogance. Esther didn't even glance up from her pot. She kept stirring the oil, watching it dance and bubble. "Well, look who's still alive," Nathaniel said with a sneer, pulling off his gloves. "Esther the cook, older than the damn stove." Thomas laughed. "She's probably still seasoning with roots and voodoo." But it was Silas who made Esther's blood turn to ice. He walked over to the kitchen table and ran his fingers over a small flower carved into the wood. Esther had burned that mark there with a nail the day her daughter was born. He pressed his thumb into it hard and smiled. "You ready to feed us, Auntie?" he whispered, not looking at her. For the first time that night, Esther turned and looked Silas in the eyes. Something passed. Vengeance. Long before she was known as Esther the cook, she was just little Essie, running barefoot in the mud behind the kitchen house, catching fireflies in her mother's old apron. She learned early to keep quiet, move carefully, and never dream with her eyes open. The plantation had eyes everywhere. Her mother, Binta, had come from the West African coast. She carried old stories in her bones and the weight of lost names in every breath. Binta never cried where anyone could see. She would only hum deep, ancient melodies while stirring gumbo or scrubbing floors. When the pot boils, Binta used to tell young Essie, "You don't scream. You wait, you watch, then you feed it what it needs." Essie was only 12 when she got her first real scar, not from a whip, but from silence. She watched her father, Jonas, get dragged through the sugarcane before dawn. They accused him of stealing a tin of molasses and tied him to the iron cross behind the smokehouse for 2 days. On the 3rd day, a young boy named Silas Rutledge threw rocks at his dying body. Esther was forced to serve breakfast to the plantation guests that morning. She didn't cry. She watched and remembered. By 15, she had become a woman in every way that mattered on the plantation. The kitchen became both her prison and her protection. People said she had the hands, meaning she could cook like magic. But cooking wasn't just about survival for Esther. It was resistance. She learned how to cut meat so perfectly it fell apart at the touch. She learned which herbs could ease pain and which could cause it. She learned what hot oil could do at exactly 375 degrees. Most importantly, she learned Ned how to look a white man in the face and make him believe she was nothing. That was her mother's final lesson. The daughter who was stolen. When Esther's daughter Clara turned 7, a letter arrived from New Orleans. Colonel Rutledge needed to pay off a debt, and the light-skinned, bright-eyed little girl was the payment. They called it an apprenticeship, but Esther knew exactly what it was. That night, she walked deep into the swamp and screamed until the frogs went silent. When she returned, her hair was soaked and her hands were bleeding, but she went straight to the kitchen and cooked anyway. She made a stew that was spicy, thick, and red. Nobody noticed anything different about it. The years crawled by. The war came and went. Men in gray uniforms, men in blue. None of them changed anything at Cypress Bend. The word slavery disappeared, but the hunger and cruelty remained. So did Esther. She stayed because leaving meant forgetting, and she refused to forget. She fed the men who had killed her past. She seasoned their joy, salted their greed, and roasted their cruelty. Every time she watched the Rutledge sons grow into monsters, she remembered what had been stolen from her, and what justice might look like. On the night before that final Thanksgiving feast, Esther sat alone in the dark kitchen. In one hand she held a wooden spoon. In the other, she held a blade no longer than her finger, her mother's knife, wrapped in old cloth. She remembered the day Binta had placed it in her palm and whispered, "When the time comes, don't hesitate. Fire needs feeding." Esther pressed the knife to her chest and closed her eyes. She didn't hesitate. The morning of reckoning, Thanksgiving morning, arrived slow and humid. The kind of thick air that sticks to your skin and seems to listen to your every breath. Ancient cypress trees stood like silent witnesses around the plantation. The bayou beyond steamed like a giant cauldron. Inside the big house, polished boots clicked across hardwood floors. The Rutledge sons strutted around in fine coats, their voices loud and crude. The former slaves, now called workers, though nothing had really changed, moved like shadows with their eyes down and hands working fast. Esther Carter stood at the center of her kitchen like the calm at the heart of a storm. The dining table was set to shame royalty. Silverware gleamed like unsheathed weapons. Roasted chicken sat stuffed and spiced. Sweet potatoes glazed in molasses. Cornbread stacked high as a monument. And in the center of it all sat the centerpiece, a great brass kettle filled with golden oil, supposedly for deep frying the turkey. The men were drunk before noon even arrived. Nathaniel, red-faced and sweating, bragged about his railroad contracts up north. Thomas boasted about re-educating freed slaves in Mississippi, teaching them how to behave like they still had chains. Silas barely spoke, content to watch and wait. His eyes kept drifting toward Esther as she moved between the dining hall and kitchen. She could feel that stare, the same look he'd given her when he told her Clara was gone forever. Esther's every movement was careful and deliberate, every dish served with precision, every word left unspoken. She poured wine with one hand while stirring the oil with the other. Outside, the sun climbed higher. Inside, the air grew thicker with tension. When Thomas made a disgusting joke about how Esther must have made the turkey from one of her cousins, the others exploded in laughter, loud, cruel, and long. Lester didn't even blink. She returned to the kitchen and added more wood to the fire beneath the oil. The flames licked at the brass, and the fat began to roll and bubble, singing its low, deadly song, the first kill. Nathaniel entered the kitchen first, swaggering like he owned the world. "Need a hand, old girl?" he sneered, reaching for the lid of one of the pots. "Don't want you dropping dead before the meal." "It's finished," He reached for the handle of the brass kettle. Esther's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her grip was like iron. Their eyes met across the steaming kitchen. "You don't touch what you don't understand," she said, her voice deadly quiet. For a moment, the entire kitchen went silent. Even the bubbling oil seemed to hush. Then Nathaniel chuckled nervously, pulled his hand back, and walked out, muttering something about uppity cooks. Esther turned back to the oil. It was almost ready. The scent was no longer just fat and fire. It smelled like Judgment Day. From the parlor, Silas called out, "Esther, bring us that turkey, will you? Let's see what you've done with our bird." She didn't answer. She picked up the carving knife, the long fork, and thick padded gloves. Behind her, the brass kettle hissed and trembled, waiting for its moment. The fire beneath the kettle had gone from hungry to absolutely ravenous. The oil inside swirled like liquid gold, thick and bubbling with the kind of heat that whispered dark promises. Esther stood before it with her back to the door, her face glowing orange in the flames. In her hands, she held two things, a long wooden paddle and 30 years of memories that would not let her rest. She wasn't thinking about turkey anymore. She was thinking about Clara, about her father Jonas, about every person who had suffered and died on this cursed land. The knife at her side wasn't for carving dinner, it was for carving justice. Every tool in the kitchen had become a weapon in her hands. The iron ladles, the sharp skewers, the cast iron skillet she'd wielded like a shield for 3 decades. She glanced once at the shelf where her mother's old spice jars still sat. Cinnamon, cayenne, asafoetida, things that helped you remember. Silas entered without knocking, just that same cocky swagger and cold smile. He leaned against the doorframe and sniffed the air like a man testing expensive wine. Smells like tradition," he said with that cruel grin. Esther didn't turn around. She just kept stirring the oil, slow and steady, like she was conducting an orchestra of revenge. "Where's the turkey, Auntie?" he asked, stepping closer. "You hiding it under your apron?" She heard his footsteps behind her. 4 steps, then silence, then a 5th step right beside her. He reached out to lift the kettle's lid. Esther moved like smoke and lightning combined. The wooden paddle cracked across his face with the sound of breaking bone. He staggered backward, gasping, hand flying to his mouth. "You broke!" he started to say, but Esther didn't let him finish. She grabbed the thick gloves, gripped the kettle by its iron handles, and in one motion that was strong, practiced, and absolutely final, she tilted it forward. The boiling oil spilled over Silas like liquid judgment. It caught him from chest to legs. His scream shattered the air and seemed to crack the very walls. He didn't fall immediately. At first, he just stumbled backward, legs blistering, arms flailing wildly, mouth open in a scream that turned into steam rising from his burning flesh. Then he collapsed, twitching and sizzling on the kitchen floor. Esther stood over him, eyes blazing, chest heaving, the empty kettle still gripped in her hands. One down. The brothers' last stand. Upstairs, Nathaniel and Thomas heard the ungodly screaming. Chairs scraped against floors, boots pounded on floorboards. Panicked shouts echoed through the hallways. "She's lost her damn mind! Get the rifle!" But Esther didn't run. She stepped calmly over the twitching body, grabbed her carving knife, and walked to the pantry. She opened it like she was selecting ingredients and pulled out another pot of oil she'd hidden hours before, covered and waiting, just in case. The screaming hadn't even finished echoing through the house when Nathaniel came barreling down the stairs with a rifle in his shaking hands. Thomas followed close behind, clutching a fireplace poker, his face pale beneath his fake bravado. Neither of them asked if their brother was dead. They could see for themselves. Esther stood calmly in the kitchen doorway, her apron streaked with oil and blood, her hands bare now, the empty kettle lying beside her. Smoke curled around her feet like it knew she was its master. "You crazy witch!" Nathaniel roared, raising the rifle, but his hands were trembling like leaves in a hurricane. Esther didn't even flinch. "Put that down," she said softly, "or I'll feed you what your brother's tasting right now." He hesitated. Thomas took a step backward. Nathaniel tried to aim, but his hands shook so badly the gun fired wide, the shot tearing through a shelf of dried beans instead of hitting its target. Esther moved like water, slipping behind the cast-iron stove as sparks flew, and the smell of gunpowder mixed with grease and death. Thomas turned to run, but Esther was already on him. She tackled him at the pantry entrance, knocking the poker from his hands. He hit the floor hard, and before he could scramble away, she brought the carving knife down, not into his chest, but between his fingers, pinning his hand to the wooden floor. His scream joined the symphony of agony filling the house. "You remember, Clara," she hissed, her face inches from his. He couldn't answer, just cried and shook like a child. Esther leaned closer, her voice breaking with 30 years of pain. "She was 7 years old, and you let them take her. You watched it happen." His eyes bulged with terror. He tried to speak, but Esther twisted the knife deeper. "I watched too," she said, tears finally coming, "and I've been choking on that silence ever since." Heavy footsteps announced Nathaniel's return. He'd given up on the rifle and was now wielding it like a club. Esther yanked the knife free and rolled aside just as the wooden talk came crashing down, splintering the pantry floor where her head had been. She kicked at Thomas's knee with all her strength, breaking it with a wet, horrible crack. His howl of pain was inhuman. Nathaniel lunged at her. She ducked behind the stove again, and he followed. Esther grabbed the second pot, still cold but heavy as a cannonball, and smashed it into his face. The iron edge caught him across the temple, and blood poured down his cheek like a red river. They wrestled in the narrow space between stove and wall. She wasn't stronger than him, but she was precise, desperate, and fueled by decades of rage. She drove her thumb into his eye socket. When he tried to choke her, she bit his arm until she tasted blood. He shrieked and loosened his grip. She kneed him in the groin with brutal efficiency. When he fell to his knees, gasping and helpless, she didn't stop. She grabbed the iron skimmer, flat, wide, designed for lifting fish from boiling water, and slammed it into his mouth again and again and again, until his teeth scattered across the floor like broken corn kernels. Silence returned to the kitchen, slow and heavy as morning fog. Both brothers lay groaning on the blood-soaked floor. Esther stood over them, breathing hard, hair soaked with sweat, arms shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of memory finally being released. She looked around her kitchen one last time, at the pots, the ladles, the blood, the justice, and whispered, "This is the only gratitude I ever owed you," the father's madness. They found the bodies 3 days later. Silas lay blistered and swollen beside the brass kettle, his mouth still open as if frozen in mid-prayer or curse. Nathaniel had bled into the cracks between the floorboards, his jaw shattered beyond recognition. Thomas clung to life a while longer, but when the doctor arrived from Baton Rouge, the broken man could only whisper, "Esther," once before slipping into a silence he would never return from. The plantation went dead. The laughter stopped completely. Horses refused their reins. Even the wind no longer sang through the sugarcane. Something fundamental had broken inside Cypress Bend, not just a crime or scandal, but something deeper, a curse. They sent for Colonel William Rutledge the same day the doctor left. He arrived at dusk, gray-bearded and stiff, smelling of horse leather and tobacco. His black coat and white gloves made him look like an undertaker arriving for his own funeral. No one greeted him. The servants had vanished into the woods. The overseers wouldn't come near the kitchen. He walked into his house alone, and the building seemed to swallow him whole. The colonel didn't weep when he saw what remained of his sons. Instead, he sat in that blood-stained kitchen, lit a cigar, and stared at the blackened kettle. It still smelled faintly of oil, and something deeper, something that made his stomach turn. Esther's apron lay nearby, folded neatly, as if it had simply resigned from duty. He took a long drag from his cigar and exhaled smoke into the rafters. "She was just a cook," he muttered to the empty room. "Just a goddamn cook." But the words felt wrong as soon as he spoke them. They echoed strangely off the soot-covered walls, bouncing back with weight and judgment, because deep down he knew the truth. Esther hadn't just killed his sons. She had boiled away the lie they'd all been living. The lie of civility, the lie of control, the lie of ownership. The lie that the kitchen belonged to him, that loyalty could be bought with scraps, that silence meant consent. Esther had taken everything he'd built and left it scalded in a brass pot. By midnight, the colonel had emptied a full bottle of whiskey. He couldn't sleep. He paced the halls like a caged animal. He screamed her name at the walls. "Esther!" as if she might walk back in and undo it all. But the house remained silent as a tomb. Around 3 in the morning, he did something nobody expected. He stumbled into the kitchen barefoot and shirtless, wild-eyed with grief and whiskey. He dragged the kettle back to the hearth, lit a new fire beneath it, and filled it with oil from the cellar barrels, oil meant for feasts that would never come. He hung the iron spoon on its hook and waited. As the oil began to heat, the house began to remember. It creaked with the weight of old sins. It moaned with the voices of the dead. They found him the next morning, kneeling before the fire like a penitent in church. The oil had boiled completely dry. His face was cracked with blisters. He hadn't poured the oil over himself. He had simply knelt there, staring into the flames, hands burned raw, eyes wide open, stone dead. The newspaper called it grief. They said Esther had escaped after a sudden and violent madness. They printed no photograph of her. They wrote no warning about her. But the workers in the fields told a different story. They said the colonel had heard her voice in the walls, heard her footsteps in the pantry. They said she came back, not in flesh, but in flame, and that he saw every name he'd ever tried to erase written in smoke on the kitchen walls. The legend lives on. Esther never returned to Cypress Bend in body, but that kitchen never cooled again. The house was abandoned to rot, and they say that every November, when the moon is full and the trees are perfectly still, you can hear oil hissing and someone whispering from the fire. Just a cook, huh? They tried to reclaim the plantation. Some white man from St. Francisville showed up with his hat tilted like he owned the sun, saying he'd clean up the mess and restore order. He claimed the house was too fine to leave abandoned, that the sugar cane would rise again if someone with a strong back and stronger whip took control. But when he stepped inside that kitchen, he vomited instantly. He said it was the smell. Rancid oil, thick mold, rats nesting in the rafters, but others knew better. The smell wasn't decay, it was memory. Memory that clung to iron pots and scorched wood, like sweat on skin. Memory that made the floor feel soft beneath your feet, like it might give way and swallow you whole. Memory that made the air thick and alive, like it had lungs of its own. No one ever stayed the night. Not the man from St. Francisville, not the crew he brought, not the armed guards he hired to patrol the fields. They all left before sundown, silent and pale-faced. Some never came back to the area. Others pretended they'd never gone there at all. The house was cursed, people whispered, but no one dared say her name out loud. They knew Esther Carter wasn't a ghost haunting the place. She was justice itself, and justice doesn't rest. How the story spread. In the former slave quarters, the story grew quietly at first. It passed between old women stirring pots, between young men hiding from night riders, between field hands who didn't believe in salvation, but believed in signs. It wasn't just what Esther did that made the story powerful. It was how she did it. She didn't run screaming into the night. She didn't slip poison into their food or disappear like a thief. She waited, she watched, and then she cooked them. That was the part that hit deepest. The fire wasn't just rage, it was ritual. She had fed them exactly what they had been feeding her people for generations. Pain, silence, heat, and justice. One boiling breath at a time. Years crawled by. The war became a scar nobody wanted to look at anymore. The land grew tired, the sugar cane thinner each season. Cypress Bend never recovered, not from the killings, not from the curse that seemed to hang over it like perpetual fog. They tried to lease the land, sell it, even rename it entirely. Nothing worked. Every time someone tried to farm that cursed earth, accidents happened. Men drowned in bone-dry ditches. Workhorses dropped dead in their harnesses for no reason. Women lost their baby, in the shadow of the old smokehouse. They buried the Rutland name under layers of silence, but the roots were still there, tangled and red with old blood. And somewhere beyond the edge of that cursed plantation, beyond the groves of choking willow and paths only the desperate knew, Esther lived on. Or so the stories claimed. No one could prove it. No one dared search for her. But sometimes, deep in the Louisiana swamps, hunters claimed they saw a woman walking alone across still water, hair wrapped in cloth, skin scarred but proud, holding a wooden spoon like a queen's scepter. She would vanish into mist before they could call out, and if they were wise, they wouldn't call out at all. The living legend. One night, decades later, a young girl in Opelousas asked her grandmother if the story of Esther the cook was really true. The old woman leaned close, her eyes cloudy with the weight of too many funerals. "She was real," she said, "as real as the hands on your arms, as real as fire, as real as every lie they told us in that house." "Did she die?" the girl asked. The grandmother smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "Not exactly, child. She became something else." "Became what?" "A name they can't bury, a truth they can't swallow." Some people said Esther went further south, crossed the Sabine River, changed her name, and lived among Creoles who didn't ask uncomfortable questions. She cooked for families who never knew about the heat that lived in her hands. Others claimed she joined a community of runaway slaves deep in the swamp, where no white man dared to venture, and became their uncrowned queen, silent, watchful, deadly with any cooking pot. And some swore she never left those woods at all. They said she became something beyond human, not a spirit, not a demon, but a warning, a story sharpened into steel, a whispered truth passed down through the cracks of history, through the mouths of those who survived. They said that every time a man lifted his hand to beat a woman, he would pause for just a breath, because something in the back of his mind would whisper, "Esther's watching." They said every field in Louisiana still echoes with the faint scent of smoke each November, and that somewhere, in some lonely kitchen where pots hiss and fires burn too clean, you might feel her standing behind you, not to hurt you, just to see, to make sure the heat stays honest. The eternal flame. The old ones said she was still out there, not in flesh maybe, but in something deeper and more permanent. In the way fire behaves when it gets too close to injustice, in the way oil hisses in a pot when the wrong person walks into the room, in the way silence falls hard when someone tells a lie too close to history. She had become a rhythm now, a heat, a story no bullet could kill, no law could cage, no preacher could wash clean with holy water. And though her name was never written in official ledgers or carved into marble monuments, it was etched into the air of every place where someone finally dared to say, "Enough." There was a young man, years later, skin dark, like burnt coffee, who worked in the kitchen of a white family in Mississippi. He was quiet, quick with his hands, careful with his eyes. The mistress called him boy, and the master called him mute. But one day, when the man of the house raised his belt to beat the cook for dropping a pot, this young man stepped forward, steady and calm. Before he said anything else, he said, "My mama told me about Esther. That belt never came down. That man never raised it again. There was a woman in Alabama who stirred her morning grits with a heavy wooden spoon passed down from her great-great-grandmother. The handle was cracked with age, the grain polished smooth from decades of use. Each time she turned that spoon, she whispered something. Not a prayer, not a curse, just a name, Esther. Her children grew up strong and proud. Her house stayed warm through the harassed winters, and no man ever dared enter her kitchen with lies on his breath or violence in his heart. The unwritten monument. They wrote thick books about generals who never bled for freedom. Between them, like lightning before a storm. "You all eating real good this year?" she said quietly. Then she went back to her pot, and the oil bubbled louder, as if it knew what was coming. The woman behind the vengeance. Long before she was known as Esther the cook, she was just little Essie, running barefoot in the mud behind the kitchen house, catching fireflies in her mother's old apron. She learned early to keep quiet, move carefully, and never dream with her eyes open. The plantation had eyes everywhere. Her mother, Binta, had come from the West African coast. She carried old stories in her bones and the weight of lost names in every breath. Binta never cried where anyone could see. She would only hum deep, ancient melodies while stirring gumbo or scrubbing floors. When the pot boils, Binta used to tell young Essie, "You don't scream. You wait, you watch, then you feed it what it needs." Essie was only 12 when she got her first real scar, not from a whip, but from silence. She watched her father, Jonas, get dragged through the sugarcane before dawn. They accused him of stealing a tin of molasses and tied him to the iron cross behind the smokehouse for 2 days. On the third day, a young boy named Silas Rutland threw rocks at his dying body. Esther was forced to serve breakfast to the plantation guests that morning. She didn't cry. She watched and remembered. By 15, she had become a woman in every way that mattered on the plantation. The kitchen became both her prison and her protection. People said she had the hands, meaning she could cook like magic. But cooking wasn't just about survival for Esther. It was resistance. She learned how to cut meat so perfectly it fell apart at the touch. She learned which herbs could ease pain and which could cause it. She learned what hot oil could do at exactly 375 degrees. Most importantly, she learned Ned how to look a white man in the face and make him believe she was nothing. That was her mother's final lesson. The daughter who was stolen. When Esther's daughter Clara turned 7, a letter arrived from New Orleans. Colonel Rutland needed to pay off a debt, and the light-skinned, bright-eyed little girl was the payment. They called it an apprenticeship, but Esther knew exactly what it was. That night, she walked deep into the swamp and screamed until the frogs went silent. When she returned, her hair was soaked and her hands were bleeding, but she went straight to the kitchen and cooked anyway. She made a stew that was spicy, thick, and red. Nobody noticed anything different about it. The years crawled by. The war came and went. Men in gray uniforms, men in blue. None of them changed anything at Cypress Bend. The word slavery disappeared, but the hunger and cruelty remained. So did Esther. She stayed because leaving meant forgetting, and she refused to forget. She fed the men who had killed her past. She seasoned their joy, salted their greed, and roasted their cruelty. Every time she watched the Rutledge sons grow into monsters, she remembered what had been stolen from her and what justice might look like. On the night before that final Thanksgiving feast, Esther sat alone in the dark kitchen. In one hand she held a wooden spoon, in the other she held a blade no longer than her finger, her mother's knife, wrapped in old cloth. She remembered the day Binta had placed it in her palm and whispered, "When the time comes, don't hesitate. Fire needs feeding." Esther pressed the knife to her chest and closed her eyes. She didn't hesitate. The morning of reckoning, Thanksgiving morning, arrived slow and humid, the kind of thick air that sticks to your skin and seems to listen to your every breath. Ancient cypress trees stood like silent witnesses around the plantation. The bayou beyond steamed like a giant cauldron. Inside the big house, polished boots clicked across hardwood floors. The Rutledge sons strutted around in fine coats, their voices loud,